we're studying an entry from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy on capital punishment, written by Robert Hogue in 2018. And so Robert Hogue is alive today. He's a retired philosophy professor at Berea College in Lexington, Kentucky. And so this essay is way in which he is showing us his specialty on the ethics of philosophy of law and also political philosophy. And so capital punishment is otherwise known as the death penalty. And in Latin, interestingly, the term is in reference to of the head. So, in other words, having to do with the root word of capitalis from caput, the head. And therefore, it's a way to refer to beheading or removing the head as a form of punishment. And so, as Hogue indicates, the death penalty is usually, although not always, a way of punishing someone for a whole range of misconduct imposed by the state or groups of people, authorities, and so forth. And it's usually thought of as an institutionalized practice. Yet there are people who implement the death penalty by outside of the law, such as terrorist groups, mobs, so on and so forth, that have killed people for wrongdoing. And so capital punishment has existed since ancient times. So we have the famous example of Socrates, who was famously ordered to drink hemlock back in 399 BC. And so Hogue points out that in the last 300 years or so, most of our philosophic discussion is centered around the reform of the death penalty in relation to the modern state and extending to the mid-20th century and also nowadays. And so we're usually calling into practice, we're calling into question the practice and considering whether or not it's cruel and unusual, especially by way of the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, and also looking at whether or not the capital punishment is arbitrary. There's the possibility of mistaking people for crimes they didn't commit. And then also there's problems of racial discrimination and the like. And so we have the fundamental problem of how to morally justify the death penalty. So, in other words, what are the moral limits to the death penalty for such crimes as murder? So, when we start looking at the philosophical understanding of how it is that we're morally justifying the death penalty, we look at such things as lex talionis. So lex talionis is otherwise known as, in Latin, as the law of retaliation, and it literally means lex meaning law and talionis meaning retribution, so the law of retribution. And it also really is captured with our phrase, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. And so there are ancient sources of that reference the death penalty, such as the Code of Hammurabi, Draco's Code, the Law of the 12 Tables, which all contain some reference to capital punishment for any number of crimes. For instance, if you used magic on your crops in ancient times, you could be crucified. Or if a holy woman enters into a tavern to drink, she could be burned alive. If you commit arson to loot a business, you could be then thrown into the very fire that you caused. And this is to say nothing of the price paid when you are not put to death, such as cutting your hands off if you steal things. If you are dishonest in certain ways, you could get your tongue cut out. Your eyes could be put out for any number of reasons. You could be whipped in public, for example. Or in medieval Europe, there's a whole number of crimes punishable by death, and the ways in which these are brought about have to do with things like dissection, methods of dissection, using the rack, boiling in oil, drawing and quartering, all of which were meant to be public spectacles. This was usually in public as a means of capital punishment as a deterrence. And one thing to think of there is that we also have to acknowledge that there is a way in which we're considering these tortures and ancient ways of killing people also as sourced in the pleasure that people have meting out punishment of others. So we do need to think that there is a certain element where people do feel some measure of pleasure when they are punishing other people. So there is that factor there. And so in the early Americas, it was said that there were such things as mock hangings. That was frequent occurrence, hanging people in absentia for crimes. And it really was in the early 18th century when prisons were invented to start considering how it is that we had alternatives to capital punishment. And so by the mid-20th century, more and more people were evaluating the practice, especially after World War II, with the Declaration of Universal Human Rights by way of the United Nations. And so nowadays, with regard to the death penalty, we're usually looking into justifying the practice with a focus on a most humane mode of doing so for such crimes as murder and other related offenses. And this type of justification is in relation to looking back to the crimes committed as we look at with retribution. And this is in contrast to looking forward in terms of considering the death penalty with reference to deterrence or a consequentialist utilitarian approach. So we have an approach that is a way that we're thinking of retribution, and then we have the approach in terms of deterrence. So we have a retributivist approach or a approach that's looked at by way of deterrence. And so with retributivism and Immanuel Kant, in terms of consequentialism, we are referencing the great Immanuel Kant, who is the developer of deontology, who didn't agree with abolishing the death penalty. So Kant's version of justifying the death penalty is by way of what we think of as lex talionis. He referred to this as jus talionis, which is not much different from lex talionis. So with Kant, we have a non-consequentialist observance of the categorical imperative, whereby we must consider the idea that I should will an action to be a universal law. And here, with the death penalty, the answer is yes, it should be observed, but not only is it to be thought of as universal, but also we should think of the punishment as tying in with what Kant is referring to as the principle of equality. And so that is to say, the universal standard should be in observance of jus talionis, i.e., the punishment should match the crime, regardless of the consequences. So yet, as Hogue observes, there is a key problem with equality, with the open question of matching punishment to the crime. That is, it is easy to suggest that if someone is guilty of murdering someone in cold blood, then it stands to reason that if a death sentence is implemented, there is an equal measure to the offense and punishment. Okay, so in other words, the principle of equality is the idea that you are aiming to match the punishment to the crime. So the punishment should be equal to the crime committed is the idea there. So what about in terms of problems with this, the perspective that the killer murdered dozens of people? And so in this same way, we could only kill someone once. Or what if they killed a bunch of people in an arson? How is it that we punish them equally? In other words, we could only kill them once, and then does that entail that we burn them alive because they committed the crime of arson while killing these people? And so forth, right? That's an open criticism of such a principle of equality. And so, as Hogue writes, to be sure, usually we do not get transfixed with such proportionality with relation to equality. Rather, we look to the idea that the amount of punishment should be proportional to the offense with serious limits regarding basic human rights of the accused. And so, where more serious crimes are to be punished by death, etc. And so, nevertheless, with this, we're still operating under the assumption that executing people is morally permissible in the first place. So even if you're saying the punishment should match the crime, you still are working under the assumption that people should die as a result of their crimes. And in that sense, that's an assumption that we make that could be scrutinized further, and we do. And so looking to retributivism and the right to life, here Hogue highlights such thinkers as St. Thomas Aquinas and John Locke, who similarly held the view that, as Locke wrote in his treatise on government in 1689, that a murderer, quote, declares himself to be a noxious creature and may be destroyed as a lion or tiger, unquote. So this is a way in which we are deterring others to keep them from doing it again, committing the crime again. So the crime of murder is a type of forfeiture of one's own right to life. Still, there are open questions as to whether or not the forfeiture of life can even be regained, or secondly, and most interestingly, is our right to life something that we can forfeit at all? In other words, if we're punishing someone in the first place, are we not suggesting that the preciousness of life is inalienable, and that the criminal took away someone's life that was an inalienable right? And so when we in turn take their life, are we not also violating the criminal's right to life? That is to suggest that our own right to life is not something we have a right to give up. And then we look at the retributivism and fairness. And so with retributivism and fairness, Hogue explains this dimension of retributivist punishment as we have an idea that we're more concerned here with ensuring the benefits for a society at large and to bring about laws that are designed to punish criminals who have benefited from taking unfair advantage of others. So this could be thought of as a means to punish by way of an unfair advantage that was gained by the criminal, an unfair advantage principle. And so this principle is considered with reference to the greater advantage gained by committing a crime. The greater punishment should be meted. So the great G.W.F. Hegel, in his philosophy of right, claimed that to annul a crime is to restore the right. And there's also cited by Hogue the philosopher Geoffrey Ryman, who suggested that this type of fairness is somewhat imprecise at first glance, whereby someone who criminally gained an advantage, say, of stealing lots of money, seems to have more to pay out for their punishment, whereby a murderer doesn't seem to have the same weight as someone who stole millions of dollars. So in other words, that issue of fairness could be a problem. And so, in other words, people who steal money, they could be paying much more than, say, someone that just simply murdered someone. And so, at face value, that's somewhat of a problem. But yet, more precisely, Ryman points out that a reasonable way to visualize the idea of fairness is to recognize that the murderer is in violation of, or the murderer violates another person's sovereignty, and that to take another's sovereign life is to see this as justifiable to take the murderer's sovereign life away by executing them as a means of capital punishment. And so at this, we could see that there is a way in which we could justify this type of fairness in light of capital punishment that gets away from the problem of trying to match exactly the way in which we're thinking about fairness. And so then we look at utilitarian approaches. And so with a utilitarian approach, we are looking at what Hogue reminds us as a forward-looking theory. So with the retributivist approaches, we were looking backward at the crime, looking back to the crime that's committed. And here, we're looking more at how it is that we're looking forward to what's benefited by the most amount of people. And so, to the extent that punishment is an aim to get us to focus on consequences rather than looking back to matching the punishment, to contrast with Lex Talionis frame of reference. So for a utilitarian, one is wanting to punish people for their crimes to consequentially bring about the most amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, in the sense that these consequences are brought about with an aim to increase the satisfaction of the most amount of people in relation to the pain brought about with the crime. So this is to emphasize that in terms of capital punishment, etc., for the utilitarian, for capital punishment to be meted out with regard to the best consequences for the greatest amount of people. Okay, and so with Hogue, to take into account the classical utilitarian perspective on capital punishment, we start out with the developer of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, who had a lot of writing and thought on the issue of punishment. And so, as a matter of fact, he was the developer of the panopticon style of prisons, so on and so forth. And so for Bentham, as a utilitarian, the goal is to better the larger whole with a punishment that is geared toward the prevention of a mischief or the mischief of crime, while at the same time recognizing that punishment is also a type of evil. So to understand that punishment is a way to prevent the evils of criminal mischief. And he thought of a threefold strategy of reformation, that is incapacitation, and by the most important end of all, deterrence. So we have reformation, incapacitation, and deterrence as his threefold strategy for Bentham, and i.e. the penalty and the good effects of the punishment must exceed the ill effects of the mischief brought about by the criminal. Ultimately, Bentham was an abolitionist. In other words, he didn't believe in the death penalty, or he wanted it abolished. To be a degree that the death penalty is not a means to bring about consequences that are a benefit for the most amount of people, including the perpetrator. So Bentham's abolitionist stance is also in alignment with the Italian criminologist Cesare Beccaria. So Beccaria is seeing punishment as a deterrent, and he also is an abolitionist who is keeping the offender from connecting to future crimes or committing future crimes, and also the punishment should deter others from doing the same crimes. For him, there is not the severity of the execution that we're focusing on in terms of the best punishment. Rather, punishment is best in its duration. In other words, capital punishment is too severe, and so what we're looking at is the best deterrent is in terms of duration. And this was servitude for life for Beccaria. And so, or life imprisonment. And also, the execution is an opportunity for formalized cruelty. And this also is something that we're still looking at today. In other words, is capital punishment cruel and unusual, especially in light of death by legal injection, that sort of thing. And so it is also an act that brutalizes more people, which is not a good consequences for the most amount of people from a utilitarian vantage. So he loosely is thought of also as a utilitarian in his way of thinking about capital punishment and punishment more as a deterrence with an aim to abolish the death penalty. So he's a voice in the 18th century who is wanting to abolish the death penalty. And on the other hand, we have a leading utilitarian who also weighed in on capital punishment. In 1868, J.S. Mill argued that he was in favor of the death penalty as deterrence. So we have J.S. Mill, on the other hand, who was in favor of the death penalty as a deterrence for the most amount of people, in that in the long run, he thought capital punishment is less cruel than a lifetime of imprisonment. For Mill, quote, hard labor for life is really a more severe punishment than it seems, while the death penalty seems more severe than it is. Okay? In other words, the death penalty is not as cruel as life imprisonment, and it also scares the most amount of people or deters the most amount of people enough to get them to not commit such crimes that got the criminal there to begin with, or that got the criminal executed to begin with. I.e., if the most amount of people are deterred, this is a way to bring about the most amount of satisfaction for the greatest number of people. And so here I'm wanting you to stop. This is the end of 3A in the entry, and so don't go past that to read 3B, okay? And then we'll continue to talk about this in class and take it from there. So there's Hoag's take on